Hi, everyone. My name is Aspen Dudzic. Welcome back to another podcast with Forestry Talks, a podcast powered by the Alberta Forest Products Association. I am super excited to be joined today by Jason Fisher. Jason, can you remind me what your title is?
I'm a partner of advisory services at MNP, working in the forestry niche.
Yes, fantastic. And you had a history working with the forest industry previously, which is how we first met.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I got my forestry degree back in 1999. I can believe that was a time. And I worked for Dunkley Lumber for a while after school. I went and got my law degree after that and practiced law mostly with forestry clients with a firm called Davis & Company, now called DLA Piper. Mm-hmm. And then I went in-house back with Dunkley Lumber and served as their vice president for 6 years. And I started to get to know Alberta Forest Products Association at that point in time. I left Dunkley Lumber and went to government, served as Associate Deputy Minister of Forests and Range and Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. Flynn Roard was the mouthful of an acronym that we had at that point in time. And worked on issues like softwood lumber, on tenures, on pricing, and left there to work with Pinnacle Renewable Energy. And that's actually when I joined the board of AFPA for a time when I was with Pinnacle as their VP of Sustainability. Yeah.
Awesome. And then, so, starting out in the forestry side of things, and you are a registered professional forester, that's correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
in BC.
Okay. Oh, important distinction. Yeah. So a registered professional forester, and then moving into the legal side, forestry, government, forestry, and then now consulting. What has that journey been like for you? What's kind of driven you to explore those different fields?
Well, I think explore is the right word. I mean, I think that the amazing thing about forestry is just how interconnected all the issues are. And how pervasive it is across the landscape. Everybody has a view of forests. Everybody has an experience of forests. Everybody has a forest that's meaningful to them, and everybody interacts with forests in a different way. And when you're, whether you're inside government or whether you're inside industry, there's a perspective that you take on it for sure. But the real key is being able to see from different perspectives. And I've been fortunate enough in my career to get multiple views of the forest. I sometimes joke that I'm like the Joni Mitchell song. I've seen the forest from both sides now, but Joni finishes that she never really knew them at all. I hope I know them a little bit. And
I think so.
Well, thank you. And I hope I get to help my clients know them better as well. And so, now in this consulting role, I really do think I've got an amazing job where I essentially get paid to talk to people I really like and help them solve problems. It doesn't get much better than that. But the problems that we solve in forestry are mostly wicked problems. There are always puts and takes. There are always different views, and we can't both preserve the things that people want preserved and use the things that people want to use at the same time, or manage for everything on every hectare or with every cubic meter. So we're always trying to make sure that we're using great science, but it goes beyond the science. It really goes to the emotional side, the relationships that people have with forests and the relationships that they want to have with forests going into the future, and the relationships that they have with each other. So that's the exciting part of it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk about the consulting piece in a little bit, but first I want to talk about, some of your experience on the forestry side. You had some experience working in maybe different parts of the value chain. What was something that was maybe really interesting for you to observe in that, transition? You talked about how connected the sector is.
Yeah.
What are some of the observations that you had in those different roles in forestry?
I think one of the things that strikes me the most is that even though forestry is an innovative sector, and if you go on to the manufacturing side, that we talk about new products all the time, we're doing mass timber, we're working with nanocrystalline cellulose, we do real-time digital grading on lumber as they go through these high-speed mills. But the relationship between forestry and the land, practices have improved, but the processes and the way that we actually engage with the land haven't really changed all that much. And they're still primarily based on that primary entry into the forest to get the log, to create value from the log. And now we're starting to see that there's more values that can be supported from the land at the same point in time, but the processes haven't necessarily caught up to enable us to do that in an efficient way. A great example is that there's the waste that gets left from harvesting in the forest, and so much of that now, so much more than it has ever gone before, is being taken out of the forest and going into bioenergy, pellet manufacturing, and the like. But we haven't taken that next step of finding the efficiencies that say, well, what's the way that we could design those blocks, not just primarily for the lumber sector, for the primary manufacturing sector, but how could we design blocks for that and biomass, so that we're thinking about creating efficiencies and maximizing value across the whole opportunity that exists with each tree harvested. And I think we're starting to think more about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm not expecting you to maybe have a sweeping declaration about how that could occur, but do you have some sense of, what are some steps that companies could take to explore those opportunities? Utilization is really important to everybody in the industry. And we talk all the time about how sustainability is at the heart of everything that we do. So looking to continue to build on that culture of continuous improvement that we have in the industry, what might some of those opportunities look like?
Well, I think when we can't just stop with that utilization piece. I think that as foresters, as forest products company, we're going to have to be able to not just say, but to demonstrate that we're leaving forests in better shape than we found them in. Yeah. And I know that there's probably some people who would scoff at me saying that, people who would point to clear cuts and the like. And it's not that they don't have valid points. Every forest is different. The situation is different. But I think that we are going to have to say, let's take a look at how our practices are leaving the overall landscape more resilient over a longer period of time. And I think that's really critical in this time of climate change. We're starting to see it with the forest fires that we've experienced in both BC and Alberta. They're not about to stop on their own. And it's interesting because when you look at the forests out on the landscape, we actually have higher densities of forest than we have in previous points in history, partly because of the way that we've managed fire over the last century. But then if you're into a drought situation, you've got stress trees, and then you get a beetle outbreak, and then you've got dead trees, and then you've got the making for catastrophic fires. And it's not that any of those things aren't part of the natural system. The question is, do we want to leave that natural system to happen the way that it's going to happen? Or is there a role that we can play in ensuring that the lands aren't, the catastrophic fires don't result in situations that are worse for people, worse for wildlife, worse for water, and don't actually achieve any of those values that we want to achieve on the land base. So it's going to get more complicated before it gets easier.
Always does.
Yeah, and it's going to require a lot more conversations, and I think a lot more education about what those puts and takes are, and what the options are, and what the opportunities are. And it's going to call on all of us as foresters on both sides of the provincial border and elsewhere to, we can't rely on other people to speak for us. We're going to have to talk about what we're doing and why. We always have to justify it to ourselves, the decisions that we make in connection to forest management. And I think we need to do a better job of explaining that to the public and being confident enough to face that scrutiny as well.
Well, that's why I'm glad you're here, so we can talk about it. I think it's a really interesting and important comment that you shared about how, sometimes we do hear or we experience those comments from people suggesting that, letting nature do its thing. And I think what people sometimes forget is, well, that's not happening because we have communities that need to be protected. We've seen some really devastating wildfires that have occurred in the province. And if we were to just let Mother Nature do its thing, those communities would be devastated. Yeah. And so you have to acknowledge that in place of that forest reset, that natural occurrence of the forest disturbance, renewing, allowing a new young forest to come up, there has to be another mechanism in place to allow for that growth to occur without putting our communities at risk. And you made a comment earlier about how there's almost these two competing priorities. How do we use this resource? But then also it's really important to have healthy forests, and it's really important to have a healthy planet. And from my perspective, and I mean, I'm biased, I work in industry, but I really see opportunities for those two, what would be considered competing interests, to work together, and how we can have working forests that enable us to have healthy forests and a healthy planet.
Yeah, I agree. And a healthy economy, and, support values that we all believe in. There's a American author, I can't remember his name, but the quote is that nature is beautiful, but it isn't always pretty. And maybe I put it another way to say that I think we all care very much about the forests, but forests don't necessarily care about us or what our agenda is, or what our ideals are. And so how do we be as creative as possible dealing with these wicked problems? Because if we do just say, let nature take its course, or let's, harvesting is bad, let's stop doing that. Well, what alternatives does that push us into? Are we happier with leaving construction to steel and concrete? Does that create a better world overall? Or do we recognize that we have this, amazing solar powered building material that also acts as a carbon sponge, and also acts as a battery, and it can be used in so many different ways, and is beautiful, and is connected to our history, and connected to our art and our culture, and not just ours, but all the people on Turtle Island here who care so much about the forests.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great segue to bring us into your experience working on the consulting side of things. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's been great so far. It hasn't been such a long time, but a lot of my work is related to what I like to call, Forestry 2.0, especially in British Columbia. Yeah. We're on this precipice of big change, particularly as it relates to First Nations rights and title, and then again on the more of an ecosystem-based approach to management. I think that those are the two big winds of change, positive winds of change. I mean, we've got the literal winds of change coming from climate change, sometimes making a mess of our best laid plans. But I feel like I get to work in that really interesting space that exists between government and First Nations and the forest sector as it is today to say, how can we all operate differently to achieve a different set of objectives and support a common set of values in the future. And, in a lot of cases, that's increasing the opportunities for participation by First Nations, not just in the hewing of wood, but in manufacturing. I just finished working on a project where we were looking at companies, First Nations companies, engaged in some aspect of forest management or forest product development or forest services in British Columbia. And there were over 240 companies that kind of were in that space.
Wow.
They're all in there in a different way, but that to me says that there is a really strong foundation to build off of, and probably lots of opportunities for finding joint opportunities, partnerships, different ways of doing things, different supplies. I was talking to one nation that was looking at putting in a mill specifically to deal with just the butt ends of Doug fir that are currently being ground up because they can't be run through a sawmill because they've got a pistol butt on them, and cutting those into slabs and selling them to furniture makers at a really good margin. And it doesn't have to be big business. There's the beautiful thing is there's these niches for all these different players to come in to find a space where maybe it's too small an opportunity for a big company to take advantage of, but where a smaller, more agile company can come in and do something different. So those are the things that really give me hope and get me excited to go to work every morning.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really cool. And speaking about that whole idea of Forestry 2.0, to use your term, looking at how there's some connections there between those partnerships with Indigenous communities, and then also continuing to advance sustainability and continuing to advance, using every part of the tree and putting it to good use. So I think that's really, really cool. I would love to know, What motivated you, or what made you kind of interested in being a part of this and making that career change?
I think it's a case of getting to a point in my career where I'm really driven by this need to try and give back, to try and do something that's good, to take maybe the tricks and the tips and the relationships and the perspectives that I brought and just try and convince people to shift their perspective just a little bit, just bring a different view into things. I truly believe that forestry provides some solutions to some really thorny problems. I do believe that there is a common ground that can be found between First Nations that care about resources and make decisions with 7 generations in mind. Yeah. And forestry opportunities that are extend out over time, and with care and management can have this near infinite possibility in front of them. I was thinking that the mining jobs, other type of infrastructure jobs tend to talk about person years of employment in relation to it, and those are always finite numbers. But when you think about it, forestry offers an infinite number of person years, because it is a truly renewable, sustainable resource.
Solar powered.
Yeah, solar powered.
Exactly. That's awesome. Jason, you were sharing with me yesterday that you consider yourself an ally of Indigenous communities. Can you tell me what that means?
Well, I mean, I don't feel like that's a title that I can take for myself. It's certainly what I aspire to be. And so I think that really is about making sure that we're having conversations with people and not about people. There's a great saying that I think came from the disability advocates who talk, say nothing about us without us. Yeah. And I feel like we still do too much of that. So what I want to try and do as much as possible is create opportunities for Indigenous communities to speak for themselves, to have real participation, and where I'm called on to be very careful about whether I'm speaking on anyone's behalf, and whether I should be doing that without first checking in. But I do also feel that change is scary, and we can create all sorts of barriers to change about things being too hard or too scary, or the consequences might be dire. But mostly what we just need to do is take a step in the right direction. Almost everything starts with a conversation. Almost everything starts with building a relationship. Almost everything starts with curiosity. And if we can, to borrow the Ted Lasso line, move from judgment to curiosity about things, and be less sure about the outcomes and more open to finding out about what the outcomes could be. I think that spot of curiosity is where we can be allies.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And maybe a way that we can look at what kind of corporate paradigm shift or shift in mindset might be required looking forward, and to how we can start to build those relationships. Something that I'm curious to know what your perspective is on is relationships really start on a foundation of trust. And of course, there's a history of really fractured trust in a lot of these relationships working with Indigenous communities. What are some steps, maybe from a practical perspective, that companies can take if they're interested in pursuing partnerships with Indigenous communities and to really build that trust?
I would say that there are. It all does start with that conversation. So, like, are you willing to go out to a community and talk and not have an agenda? Leave all your maps and your presentations in the car and come in for a cup of coffee. And maybe it's just a cup of coffee to start. And maybe it's going to take months, but that's where trust and relationships come from, is from putting time in, from sitting across the table with each other. I trust you way more now than I did before. I thought you were a little shady, but I'm feeling much better about our relationship now. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that.
and that really is where it starts. And when I hear people who have been successful, it's been the people who are willing to set their agenda aside and really listen and really think about co-development as opposed to presenting an opportunity. and recognizing that what I'm telling you might be completely wrong in some contexts, because like everyone else, First Nations they're all different from each other. They have a different relationship with the land. They have different governance. They have different histories. And unless you're curious about finding that out, you're going to make some assumptions that could steer you wrong. So come in prepared to be, wowed by the generosity, prepared to be, heartbroken by some of the experiences, prepared to create relationships that are going to become, more important than any business to business opportunity ever would be, that are really about what could we do together to make the world better, to make this part of our world the better that we share together.
Yeah. That's awesome. In your role as a consultant with MNP, are you seeing some positive examples of these relationships and partnerships here in Alberta?
In Alberta, it's starting. I'm seeing a lot more interest. I think it's one of the trickies in this field is that there's never just two dance partners. There's always the provincial government and the federal government that are involved in things as well. And so, we're going to have to get to a point where we kind of take a look at all the dance steps and figure out whether we're going to keep doing the waltz all the time, or whether we're going to find a new way to exist together and make decisions together that are going to support these relationships over time. But I do see a lot of interest in learning, and a lot of exploration, and I definitely know that there are some parties out there that have come a long way and have some really strong relationships. So it gives me hope. It's a forest comes from a single seedling sometimes.
But it's sure going to grow.
It's sure going to grow.
That's awesome. Jason, what has maybe been one of the most surprising or impactful things that you've learned in your journey so far?
Oh gosh.
Tough question.
Yeah.
I know.
There's lots of things. I think the most impactful thing for me is that there's always someone to learn from. No matter what you think you don't know it all. That it's not enough to say that you have values, that you have to live them. For me, that was experiencing a real low point in my life, and knowing that I had made, what was really important to me was being a father and a husband first, and then figuring out how that was going to I still want to have an interesting career. I still want to have a career where I help people, but I'm not willing to have that at any costs. And that was really important for me to recognize as well. It's a really good question. And I can't think of just one, because there's so many different aspects of my life where this has touched me. I've made some of my best friends in the world through forestry. I've learned so much through forestry. I met my wife through forestry. I've been in some of the most beautiful places that I've ever seen through forestry, and I'm glad I'm not done yet, because there's lots more to do.
Okay, well, Jason, this has been really fabulous. Thank you for joining me for this. In case there's anyone who wants to get a hold of you to ask some more questions or learn a little bit more about what you do or how they can be involved, how can they get in touch?
Sure. My email is jason.fisher@mnp.ca. You can find me on LinkedIn, Jason Fisher, and on the MNP website as well. So I'd appreciate any questions or other conversations that this might start.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you.
This series is proudly produced by the team at Road 55. Road 55 creates content that connects. For more information, check our website, www.road55.ca.